I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. Today I'll be speaking with one of RANE's Directors of Analysis, Sam Lichtenstein, about the outlook for election violence and general political unrest in the United States. Hi Sam, how are you?
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
So, in order to contextualize behaviors surrounding the current political environment and better understand what we can expect going forward, can you set the stage by giving us a brief history of political violence in the U.S.?
We really need to always start when we think about these broad topics, and especially one is sensitive of political violence, in looking at the context. You have partisans on both sides of the aisle, quite frankly, who, of course, are looking to score political points when they talk about political violence. Either it's all the Democrats' fault, it's all the Republicans' fault, it's the media's fault, it's someone's fault. And there may be truths to all of that, but you really do need to go back into history. And so I won't try to bore too many of our listeners, but I do think it's important that we start with some of the historical context. Just even going back to our founding, as a country, we were born out of political violence. We did not break away from the United Kingdom in a peaceful manner. Now, of course, we as Americans see this as eminently justified, part of a narrative of expanding freedom against, a tyrannical state, all of which very well may be true. But if we're going to get down to the specifics of it, this was an act of political violence. We were rebelling against what we saw as an unjust overlord in London. And there may have been good reasons for that. But when we think about just our founding history, that idea of using violence to achieve a political end, regardless of whether we think it's right and justified, that's baked in from the start. So I do think it's important just to frame it that way. This is not something that is unique in the American experience. It's not something new, but political violence is there from the beginning. Obviously, throughout the centuries that we've been a country now, we've seen obvious outbreaks of political violence at various points. Of course, the Civil War being by far the most dramatic. But we've seen multiple successful and an even larger list of attempted assassinations against U.S. presidents, presidential candidates, a whole slew of legislators, other high-profile individuals, activists, etc. We could spend hours going through this list. Tragically, the point is to say that the idea of people using violent means to achieve a political end, again, regardless of our thoughts on whether or not that's justified, this has been a recurring theme throughout U.S. history. Now, if we go a little more towards the recent past, part of the challenge in quote unquote measuring political violence is that there's no very obvious metric to do this. We can look at the number of attempted assassinations, we can look at successful assassinations, we can look at other forms of violence, we could try to track, the threats of violence, but all of these things are quite disparate. It's hard to compare, how times quote unquote feel in one political, period compared to another. So we have to acknowledge that we're also not basing this entirely on kind of quantifiable evidence that you can easily compare one period to another. But if we do look at kind of the most recent past, it does seem to be the case that kind of the high watermark in previous decades was political violence in the 1970s, probably the late 1960s or into the 1970s. Now, of course, at that time, we were, as a country, deeply polarized. When people talk about the United States today being uniquely polarized, I would say it may be polarized, but it's certainly not unique. If you go back to the late 60s, 70s, we're talking about Vietnam War, civil rights era, a whole host of really divisive issues here in the country. And when you look at the 1970s, that was probably when we last saw the largest spate of political violence. What made that era, I would say, a little bit different is two things. One, the vast majority of attacks were directed not against people. We did see some assassinations and such, but they were mostly directed against property. And number two, the vast majority of the threat actors we're talking about were from the proverbial left side of the political spectrum. So everything from anti-war groups to Puerto Rican nationalists, Black Panthers type of activity. You did have some far-right violence, but what made the 1970s different, I would say, again, these two ideas of it was mainly from the far left and it was mainly targeting property. When you go through the recent past, even beyond the 1970s, I'm just talking about in the last decade or two, we do seem to see a shift, I would say, beginning in the 2010s towards, again, a resumption of political violence in the country. Thankfully, not necessarily with a massive spate of, high-profile assassinations, but we did see an uptick in violent attacks against congressional legislators, against various officials in government. And crucially, I would also say, beyond just the actual violent attacks, we have seen a dramatic uptick in reports of threats of violence, whether it's kind of the online rhetoric, whether it's what we've seen recently with things like swatting, where people will call, law enforcement to a property to basically scare someone with a massive police response. All of these different types of kind of harassment, intimidation. Again, it's hard to track the metrics precisely, but by all means that we have, there has been this increase. And I think one of the things that really goes overlooked is that while we have seen a lot of high-profile issues at the national level, really the people that are most vulnerable are at the local and state level. And this makes sense when we think about it for two reasons. One, most national leaders and high-profile individuals have some form of security. Obviously, some have much more than others. Leading presidential candidates, it may not be perfect, but certainly, they travel in massive security bubbles. Whereas if you're a local or state politician, absent some extremely unique case, they almost certainly have no physical security protection. The second, reason that this makes sense is that from an attacker's perspective, yes, of course, they want to cause, a dramatic attack if they can against a super high-profile person, but fundamentally they want to take out their violence on someone that is accessible to them, someone that they see as most responsible for whatever their grievance may be. And for those two reasons, it's natural to focus more on the local or state officials, politicians, individuals that are much more easily accessible compared to kind of national politicians that have more protection and to be blunt are much more geographically remote than from most people in the country. So that brings us obviously to the current election cycle. It goes without saying because unfortunately I think we basically see a new headline every day, basically warning that the country is at this peak of political violence risk, and we're all a bit proverbially on pins and needles ahead of the vote on November 5th. I know you and I will talk more about that in detail later in this conversation, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But I do think it's important that we kind of trace that narrative, and of course we can go into far more detail into any of those historical periods, but I hope that gives us a little bit of an overview to trace from the founding of the country to the present day.
Yeah, I think that sets the stage perfectly. And can you go into a little bit how these patterns in U.S. election violence compare to that of other nations historically and leading up to current day?
Sure. So, again, it's, just as it's hard to compare times within the United States history, it's, also hard to compare the United States to other countries in the aggregate, just given the amount of differences, a country of 300 million plus, a huge economy, the world's largest, democratic country. How do you compare those features with, much smaller countries that may be authoritarian, very small economic output, very different political systems? You can't. It's not an apples to apples comparison, to say the least. But there are a couple things that we should point to. The first thing I would say is, even when we think of the most democratic and most kind of egalitarian countries, say in Western and Northern Europe, say think of Norway or Sweden, countries that are often compared to as kind of being more idealistic compared to the United States. Idyllic compared to the United States. Regardless of whether that's true, I think it's important to also acknowledge these countries too have foundings and past histories that saw, mass political violence. These countries also tend to have histories that extend far back into time, the United States. And so, even if you look at, a country like Norway or Sweden that we might see with envy in some of their social programs and things of that nature, hundreds of years ago, they were also settling scores through violence, in some cases a lot more intensely than, even the United States. First, I think it's important to acknowledge that all countries have some history of political violence. It's hard to find anywhere on the planet that hasn't seen this in some capacity. But I do think there are a few things we could say. One, in general, and of course, for every generality, there are counterexamples, but they're generalities for a reason. They generally capture the sentiment. When you have a country that is democratic, that goes through routine, peaceful transfers of power through free and fair elections, where civil liberties are generally respected, the opportunities and the incentives for political violence are far lower. And the punishments for when they happen, either through the ballot box or through law enforcement, are much greater compared to less democratic, more authoritarian countries where the transfers of power is not always peaceful or smooth, where competing for power isn't just decided at the ballot box, but often decided through the barrel of a gun. So we can start to make some distinctions based on the types of governments. For those reasons, it's not surprising that tragically, when we think about political violence, despite, we have these periodic upticks in a lot of Western countries, we see much more intense, frequent, routinized forms of political violence throughout many developing countries. Places where democratic governments, transfer of power in a peaceable fashion, civil liberties protections, et cetera, are far less reliable, far less routinized than in the West. And so, unsurprisingly, election periods are almost always a very clear trigger for this. When you have an election period that is either not seen as free or fair, or one where, the outcome may actually be generally free and fair, but the stakes are so high because you don't know, whether the elections the next time around will be the same way. These type of things almost always are clear triggers for violence in plenty of countries, both before and, of course, after the election, depending on the outcome. If you don't believe that the election is going to be free and fair, there are obvious incentives to carry out various forms of attacks before the vote. And crucially, after the vote, if the outcome is seen as being fraudulent, opposition groups obviously have strong incentives to also take to the streets and carry out violence thereafter. I should also point out that this is, of course, not a proverbial one-way street. The authorities in these countries have just as much, and in some cases, a lot more incentive and capability to carry out violence. If you're in a system where, you don't have to worry as much about civil liberties, where you don't need to worry as much about pressure or backlash from your citizenry because, you, the ruling government, hold all the proverbial cards, it's also much more easy for you to engage in political violence, going after, opponents politically, activists, journalists, anyone that, is potentially seen as a threat. And so for those reasons, we don't just see, attacks from, the proverbial lone actors or small, activist groups that do something, but we also really routinely see politically motivated violence from the government itself. And of course, plenty of Western countries, you have activist groups that say, listen, the police or the security services are way too heavy-handed in putting down this protest or what have you, and there are plenty of valid cases for that. But when you look at developing countries, again, where you don't have this routinized peaceful transfer of power, emphasis on rule of law, etc., it's much more easy for the ruling government to also engage in political violence. So in that way, it's a two-way street. You have the government doing things, you have opposition groups doing things, and you're kind of caught in the spiral where the lack of trust, and that's something to really emphasize in just a moment, means that both parties have strong incentives to engage in extra legal and oftentimes violent conflict. And let me just touch on that last point for one more moment, Emma. The lack of trust is a key variable as well, that goes alongside those democratic institutions, rule of law, et cetera. It's hard to separate these things. They often go together, either because they're increasing or tragically they're decreasing. But, one of the things that we can also note that can separate countries that are more at risk of political violence than others is how much, there is trust in government. There's trust that the legal system will act fairly. There's trust in institutions to act impartially. The more trust you have, obviously, the less incentive and feeling you need to go out and commit violence against something or someone. Just as the less trust you have in these things, obviously the more attractive and in some cases for some people necessary it becomes to carry out violence. I'm sure plenty of academic ink has been spilled on this question. There will be only more academic studies out there, so I certainly don't want to belabor these points, but hopefully that kind of gives a sense of how we can generally conceive some of the differences among different countries and political systems. Trust in the United States has been steadily eroding, to say the least. This is again a trend I would say began a few election cycles ago, but has only increased sadly in recent times. Regardless of how you feel about who's responsible for January 6th, or whether it was, as the Trump camp would portray it, kind of a conspiracy that's now being thrown against him to try to slander him and his chances of reelection, or from, Democrats and law enforcement's perspective, which is, it was Trump that was kind of egging on this crowd that went on to do this horrific act. Put those points to the side for the moment. From the Trump campaign for, stretching back to the 2020 election, has said, as have, huge numbers of Republicans, if you look at surveys, overwhelming majorities say the 2020 election was still stolen. Now, potentially some of those people don't actually believe that. They kind of just feel that's the narrative they need to say. But regardless, the fact that they feel that they need to say it speaks volumes. And, the Trump campaign for months now, and only intensifying in recent weeks, has been sowing doubt about the integrity of the 2024 polls, and basically saying, if Trump loses, the only way that could happen is because the polls were rigged. Now, from the Democrats' perspective, they have not been, I would say, as brazen or explicit in challenging the vote and the process. But I will tell you absolutely, if Trump prevails on November 5th, or more likely in a few days thereafter, because personally I think it's unlikely that we'll get a clear outcome that evening, absolutely the Democrats are going to make various electoral challenges, just as, the Republicans will make plenty if Trump loses. And so, even if we don't have the leaders of parties that are calling for violent attacks, the fact that we've already seen, hundreds of preemptive lawsuits being filed in multiple states challenging various parts of the voting process, and bear in mind, we are just starting to mail out, absentee and early voting ballots. The real vast majority of voting has not begun yet. That really speaks volumes about our trust or lack thereof in the system. And so, regardless of who wins this vote, if it is at all close, and quite frankly, even if it isn't, there is going to be a huge legal battle in the wake of this election. And, I really think that reflects our lack of trust, whether it's at, the state, local, or federal level, whether it's about, the accuracy of voting machines, whether it's about the validity of mail-in ballots, whether it's about the way in which certain, questions were phrased on various ballot initiatives. There's so many things here that are at legal stake that I think it really tells a lot about how we as a society have come to see elections not necessarily as something that we just trust at face value, but actually something that we explicitly feel like needs to be investigated. And that, of course, when you raise those concerns, it automatically calls into question the outcomes, because even if you have all of these investigations and subsequently you basically find that the vote didn't really have any irregularities, which by the way, I don't want to be political, but for all of the Trump campaigns posturing over the 2020 vote, every single investigation was basically found to have zero basis, or just entirely thrown out from legal battles. It doesn't really matter if you've primed your supporters to automatically question the results. What eventually is found out, in investigations doesn't really matter. You've now planted that seed, and it kind of automatically lowers the threshold for someone to not only disbelieve the results, but to actually feel like he or she has to proverbially take matters into their own hands.
So given all this background and the current political factors at play in this election, what are the specific scenarios for U.S. election violence that you and the team are looking at now, and how do they vary in likelihood and impact?
Yeah, so Emma, as and hopefully many of our listeners know, one of the flagship products that we produce is something called a key forecast question. We have about 24 of these on our geopolitical platform, and basically they track a question over time, and we try to pick questions that we think are valuable from our clients' perspectives and that are also generally impactful for the globe. And so one of these questions that we instituted was basically, how does political violence in the United States evolve by February 2025? And we picked February 2025 because Inauguration Day is January 20th. And so, we wanted to be very clear that we didn't see the risk of political violence stopping right after the election, or even after the certification on January 6th, or even after the inauguration. But we actually felt that we need to track it for, into the following month of February, just given how polarized the country currently is. And so, when we come up with these scenarios, I won't bore our listeners with how we develop it, but it's a very, very intense analytic process. The analytic nerd in me really loves it, but it is very difficult. We ended up with 5 different scenarios. And, the basic distinction that's probably easiest to understand is one scenario was basically a scenario of deep political polarization with a lot of violent threats, but relatively few violent incidents. The other 4 scenarios were all various forms of an increase in violence. So, automatically, just based on our scenario creation, the listeners can understand when we built this key forecast question at the end of 2023, how we envisioned things playing out. We were not terribly optimistic. Now, having said that, we started our baseline forecast with that first scenario of deep political polarization, lots of violent threats, but relatively few violent attacks, as our most likely baseline scenario, and the other 4 more escalatory violence scenarios as our lower likelihood alternatives. Tragically, if you track this over time, beginning in about the middle of this past year and continuing since then, the baseline scenario of lots of violent threats but relatively little violence has steadily decreased to the point where right now, after what appears to have been the latest assassination attempt against the former president, we consider that scenario to only have a 10% likelihood, which means that our 4 escalatory scenarios of more violence now have a combined 90% likelihood. Now, this is not something that is static. This is a continually evolving process. So, as we get more information and see how the process in the voting develops over the coming weeks, how we see the outcome of the election, I sincerely hope as a U.S. citizen that we will swing back towards that baseline scenario. Unfortunately, me as the analyst, I don't feel as likely about that for a number of reasons that we can get into. But just to give our listeners a brief overview of those other four scenarios, and we always try to build scenarios, Emma, that are relatively mutually exclusive, but inevitably there is some overlap, and I would say you could consider some of these at least having some characteristics that fall into multiple of these. So the first scenario that I should lay out, because this we ruled out actually multiple months ago, was one in which the Republican Party divided over Trump's candidacy, and there was basically intra-Republican violence. When we built the scenario, we considered it to be a very unlikely scenario. We actually began that scenario, I think it was our least likely when we first opened this key forecast question. And that has clearly played out. We actually, over 2 months ago now, took this scenario to zero. Obviously, Trump became the Republican Party nominee. For many months, he had been clear that he was really the only real person in the race. So, that we don't even consider to have any sort of a likelihood anymore. So now we're talking about three other really primary scenarios that see violence increasing. The first would basically be a surge in primarily right-wing violence against the U.S. political system. This is a pretty broad scenario where we envision, right-wing supporters of Trump basically feeling aggrieved about his conviction, and particularly, what would potentially be his election loss, that basically surge violence against general targets throughout the country. We're talking not necessarily about focusing the violence on any particular buildings or types of individuals, but kind of a general uptick in attacks against, government institutions, judicial system, Democratic politicians, leftist activists, etc. Again, Trump's conviction and his potential election loss would be the key triggers here. The conviction thus far has, I would say, thankfully not motivated a surge of violence, but it's fed that grievance narrative, absolutely. And if Trump were to lose the election, especially given the rhetoric that his campaign has put out in recent weeks, basically portraying him as a victim of this vast conspiracy, both legally through the court system, and now through actual acts of violence directed against him. If you added on to that, at the ballot box, if the polls, actually, if the election does actually see him lose, absolutely we would be concerned about kind of this surge in right-wing violence against the U.S. political system. The second scenario that is a variation of that is one in which violence surges specifically against the electoral process. And we currently weight this higher because when we look at Trump's rhetoric and that of his other key allies in recent weeks and months, they very clearly, as I've mentioned, already been calling into question the integrity of the polls, basically telling supporters that, listen, if Trump loses, you shouldn't believe the outcome. The election would have to have been rigged. Rhetoric like that, is priming supporters to not trust the voting process. Even independent of political rhetoric, we already have kind of neutral observers that are putting questions out there about whether, mail-in ballots will be ready on time and, whether we can trust the Postal Service to get things, delivered on time. So, there are real concerns here, not just politically motivated ones. And so, our second most likely alternative scenario right now would be that one in which political violence against the electoral process surges. And what that would look like would be specifically against anything related to voting infrastructure. So we're talking about attacks against poll workers, voting sites, the local political offices, government offices where you have, counties that report election outcomes, etc., public officials' homes, basically anyone connected to the voting process would be at risk. And then finally, what is currently actually our most likely scenario is one in which there is actually a victory for President Trump in the election that categorizes both far left and far right violence. And so this scenario basically envisions Trump, winning the presidency despite being convicted, and that leads to basically an outpouring of grievance from both far left individuals as well as retaliatory violence from far right individuals. This would increase the risks to a whole host of groups. We're in this scenario where we're conceiving of significant street violence, targeted attacks against various buildings, and again, the overlap here does exist with some of these other scenarios, but the key distinguishing feature in this one is that Trump wins the election, and that spurs grievance from his opponents and then retaliatory violence from his supporters. So that's a brief overview of how we're currently envisioning things. We are not in the business of calling elections. That's not what we look to do. They're far more capable, election observers, pollsters, forecasters who do that type of work. But what we are in the business of thinking through is, okay, in the plausible scenarios out there, how could they come about and what would the implications of them be? And so I hope that just a brief overview of those scenarios offers some thoughts.
Could we go into how potential external activity outside the U.S., how that will impact divisions within the U.S. and subsequently the outlook for political violence?
Sure. So, there are a whole host of things that could happen abroad or either be directed from abroad towards the United States that would seek to affect the outcome of the polls. First of all, I should always say there's the proverbial October surprise, something that is unexpected, that shakes up the race at the last moment. That could be a domestic incident, but it could very easily, given the state of the world, be something abroad, whether it's a major development in, one of the wars, say, in the Middle East or Ukraine, another flashpoint, say, in the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea, some sort of major development that would impact the United States absolutely could shake up the race. And that, I think it's important to note, for those voters who are still undecided, the vast majority of research indicates that they really make up their minds in really the last few days or week of the election campaign. So really what's on their minds at the very end is often what will sway their votes. So that's why these things matter. I should also point out that, unsurprisingly, foreign powers, just as they have in every recent election cycle, are very clearly trying to influence this election cycle. Now, I should firstly say that, for no matter what foreign powers do, it's always going to be domestic groups that have the greatest influence. However, absolutely, we see a whole variety of foreign influence activity from, the groups that you would most expect it, namely Russia, China, and Iran, which, have historically been the three most active countries in trying to affect the outcome of the election. Each of them has different intents in their activity. They also have different capabilities. For instance, the Iranians seem to be very, very clearly trying to interfere and prevent former President Trump from retaking the office. He is a big target of ire for Tehran, and it's not a surprise that they don't want to see him back in office. There was even a disrupted assassination plot against him about a month and a half ago, in which Tehran was not explicitly blamed by the Department of Justice as being responsible, but strongly hinted that they were involved in some way as kind of part of their larger campaign to go after former Trump administration officials who oversaw the killing of IRGC Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. You have Russia, which on the opposite side, whatever Vladimir Putin says about preferring Vice President Kamala Harris, it's very clear that the Russians have a strong interest in the United States forcing Ukraine to kind of accede to negotiations. And the candidate that is clearly more likely to do that is former President Trump. And so I think it's not a surprise that, yes, the Russians generally want to interfere fear and sow chaos and cast doubt and basically stoke any sort of societal discord, but they also do prefer someone that would be Trump, who is going to basically pressure Ukraine into negotiations. As for China, of the three, it's generally been the least aggressive in its policies. China has generally focused a lot more on carrying out espionage, collecting information, but we have seen over the last year or two, sporadic incidents that show that Beijing is clearly trying to engage in more influence activity. I would say as of now we see a clear intent. We don't see as much capability. The Chinese information operations, compared to the Iranians and especially the Russians, don't seem to be as sophisticated or capable, but they are definitely still a threat actor here that is absolutely seeking to collect information, and their general worldview, even if they don't align with the Russians on everything, they, like the Russians, have an interest in weakening the United States. And so, all of these actors are absolutely already and will continue to be involved. In fact, their attempts to influence the election will presumably only grow in the coming weeks as we get closer to Election Day on November 5th. And by the way, beyond these three, I should also mention that, there are a host of other governments in the world that have both an intent and a capability to influence the United States, even if it's not as brazen as some of the propaganda and influence operations we see from Russia, China, and Iran. Just thinking through, say, the Middle East, Israel, the Gulf states, they all have very strong interests in, persuading portions of the electorate and the eventual victor of not only the presidential but crucial congressional races to, go for certain policies. Even the Europeans, they're not by any means interfering and spreading propaganda like you see other countries doing, but absolutely there's a ton of lobbying that, European governments are trying to do because they also have a large stake in this election. And you can go down the list, but there's so many countries that have some combination of either intent, capability, or both to in some way, influence the outcome here, or at least prepare for it, that, what happens abroad, either, on its own or directed from abroad to the United States, absolutely plays a role here.
Looking forward to after the election and inauguration, what can we expect in terms of political violence in 2025 and beyond?
Yeah, so, I don't want to say I'm glad for us to end here, Emma, because I think glad is probably the wrong word. But I do think this is, really where we want to end because, in our perspective, the real violent risks are not going to manifest necessarily ahead of November 5th. What we as a team and me personally as a citizen are concerned about is the risk of political violence after the election. Obviously, anything can happen in the polls. They could dramatically shake up in the next 7 weeks. But if current polling is accurate, if the election were held today, it would really be a coin toss. We have about, it seems, 7 battleground states where Trump and Harris are polling basically within the margin of error in all of them. And so the election, it seems to be extremely likely to come down to a fairly small number of votes in a few, if not states, potentially even just specific counties. So take what you saw in 2020 and perhaps even make it even closer. And so, given what I already said with the preemptive lawsuits that we've seen, the many, many more we'll expect after the vote, I think it's very likely that not only will we not have a clear winner for some time after the election, but there is a real risk here that the election outcome will not be merely legally challenged, but outright disputed. And, I don't mean to be political here, but, just based on rhetoric and what we've seen, I think it's safe to say that the Trump campaign is far more likely to outright dispute the result than the Harris campaign. And, if that were to happen, that would confirm the narrative that Trump and his advisors have been saying for months, which is basically, listen, the polls are rigged if I don't win. The only way I could lose is if, they were fraudulent. And now it's up to you to fight for me. Now, Trump has used a lot of aggressive, incendiary rhetoric. He frequently, though, kind of walks up to the proverbial line without necessarily crossing it, in that he doesn't explicitly come out and say, you need to take your guns and go fight for me. You do have some people in his orbit that make much more aggressive statements like that, but he usually kind of leaves his interpretations open to a little bit of questioning, so it's not precisely clear that he's inciting violence. Just kind of more like leaving the door open to it. But, if you saw Trump and his key backers more explicitly not merely dispute the results, but, call for supporters to take to the streets, that's where I think we really come into a scary scenario, because you now have, lots of his supporters who have been primed to not believe the outcome of the election. They've now endured 2 assassination attempts against him. They've seen him be convicted in New York State. And so, the narrative that he's built about kind of this vast conspiracy against him, from that perspective, they would think it's true. After all of this, the election is close and, a couple thousand votes in X county decided for Harris. Well, clearly this is, a rigged election. And if that's the case, that's where I really think the concerning scenario opens up, because you could have a prolonged period of attacks by Trump supporters and, as we talked about in one of the election scenarios, also Trump opponents then counterattacking. We could really see a whole host of really bad things happen where you see assassination attempts, bombings, civil disturbances like looting, arson, the creation of urban encampments. You could see January 6th style kind of storming of various sensitive sites. If people truly believe that the election is kind of this existential contest, if they're on the losing end of that, then they proverbially don't have anything to lose anymore. And it plays into those grievance narratives that have been building for months, if not years, since the 2020 vote. So, I don't want to leave our listeners with such a depressing thought, but I do think it's really important, as analysts, we owe it to our readers, to our listeners, et cetera, to think through, okay, the what if scenarios. And I think that not only is that tragically plausible, but the closer we get to the election day, the more actually likely I think it is.
Thanks, Sam. I know you guys are following this closely, and I look forward to hearing more from you as more develops in the future.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Emma. And I sincerely hope as a citizen, we don't see all of the terrible things I scoped out. But, I will say that we as a team, as you say, are preparing for the proverbial worst. And, we do want to make sure that readers, clients, people are thinking about this because there could tragically be real physical security implications for a lot of us.
As Sam was saying, our analysis team is further exploring the outlook for U.S. election violence as well as other major security risks in our fourth quarter forecast, which will be available on and after Monday, September 23rd. Find out how you can access the forecast by contacting us at our website, ranenetwork.com, where you can also learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.